For those of you who do not know the Burnswark site, and I suspect there are very few of you who don't know it, it's in eastern Dumfriesshire and lies uncomfortably close, I'm sure, if you were a native to western end of Hadrian's Wall, the lower dots, Carlisle. And the site itself you can be seen on the northern skyline from pretty much the whole of the western end of Hadrian's Wall. The complex itself, as Jack has said, is a 7-hectare Iron Age fort crowning the 1,000 feet high summit of Burnswark Hill, and it's flanked most notably by 2 Roman camps, which are so striking that the earthworks can be seen from space. And when you look at it in close-up, it consists of 2 very unusual shaped camps. The north camp has a clavicular shaped entrance here, very elongated, it looks like 2 camps stuck together, and the southern one has two main features. One is what has always been called a fortlet in its northeastern corner, and 3 gate covers, elongated mound-like tituli, that are still 3 metres in height, and they've always been interpreted up to relatively recently as ballistic platforms. So when you look at the site from the south, the first thing that you notice is that there's a modern plantation here on the eastern side of the summit, and that has precluded our searches in that particular area. These are the 3 tituli, and this is the so-called fortlet in the northeastern corner, which has been reinterpreted recently as a native homestead. And you can see the way the camp has actually been angled to take in that homestead. This is the northern camp, facing the northern aspect of the fort, which is much steeper than the southern aspect. So what's the big question? What's going on here? Is it a siege? Is it a true siege? Has there been an investment by the Roman army to either starve out or assault the native population on the summit? Or is it indeed a training ground as described by numerous Roman authors, that the Roman army would train as if in actual battle? And how would you differentiate? Is there any way at all that we can differentiate between these two? And we're going to look a little bit at the role of new technology and perhaps lead us to a different or a slightly different understanding of the relationship between the fort and the Roman camps. It's so noticeable, Burnswark, that it appears in the very first edition of the Society's Transactions in 1792, and at that point was preferred as an anonymous paper. But just about anybody who's anybody in Romano-Caledonian or Romano-British archaeology has had their finger in the Burnswark pie right through to the current day. And up till about this point, it was always considered the site of a siege, a genuine siege. But in the 1960s, George Joby carried out what has been to date the biggest and best excavation on the site, most thorough. And he, influenced by Kenneth Steer, who made the suggestion first in 1964 that it was a battle school for the Roman army where they learned to build camps, but particularly it was an artillery range that allowed the Roman troops to have a combination of ballista practice and also slinging practice. So it was on that basis that George Joby published the work in the 1970s. And it got into the popular literature at that point as a training camp, and has gone on to be exemplified in various popular works as the Roman army sort of looking into the sun. There's not much sun in Burnswark Hill, by the way, if anyone's ever been there. Looking into the sun to see where the latest missile has gone. And that's how it was envisaged. And in fact, David Breeze very usefully has collated all of the arguments for and against and published this a couple of years ago in the Archaeological Journal. At the end of that article, David had to come down in favour of a training camp. But there have been voices of dissent, particularly from Duncan Campbell and Lawrence Keppie, who have said have argued quite strongly that it was indeed the site of an actual element of warfare. And as Lawrence Keppie pointed out, the whole idea of battle schools and training camps came to the fore in the 1960s and 70s, when there was a bit of a vogue for seeing unusual native earthworks as potentially Roman training sites. And this is Woden law, and of course this was seen as a siege work, a Roman siege work, and a couple of the little mounds and lumps were seen as ballista platforms. And these sites have been reinterpreted, particularly Cawthorne in England, and they've been reinterpreted actually as either a conventional Roman camp, as in the case of Cawthorne, or native works, as in the case of Woden law. So the bottom line is the data that we have is almost more than 50 years old, and it's been diced and sliced in just about any way that you like. So it can be used, some arguments can be used for a siege, some of the same arguments can be turned over on their back for a training camp. And there is one in particular that I just want to mention here because it's relevant to our findings, and that's the so-called alignment that's repeatedly mentioned in works, the alignment of three brethren to the three south-facing hill fort gateways. Come back to that in a second. Another one that I want to just slightly emphasise is why were they using lead sling bullets rather than much cheaper and much more economic clay sling bullets that were prevalent at the same time. And the finds from Burnswark, certainly the ballistic finds, are quite striking. There are indeed ballista balls, although these are slightly on the small size, and for those in the know, it's suspected that they're either hand-thrown stone balls or they are slung stone balls, because some of them are about half a kilogram in weight, but there are undoubtedly 2 or 3 larger ones that were probably ballista balls. There are trilobate arrowheads, 9 of them so far, and they were found in the 2 gateway areas that Joby excavated, and that was new, they hadn't been found before. The thing that we're interested in are the lead sling bullets, the glandes, and they come in 2 flavours in Burnswark. There's an acorn, a very distinct acorn-shaped one, which is quite nice because it seems to rhyme with the word glandes, the Latin word for acorn, and the lemon-shaped ones. And these have been called Type A and Type B, or Type 1 and Type 2, by Greek in his review of sling bullets from Britain. And somehow, again, the acorn-shaped ones have got into the literature as being fairly widespread, and the other shape type of lead sling bullets. Our work has shown that, in fact, we've reviewed not just the sling bullets in the UK, but the sling bullets in Europe, that these acorn-shaped ones are unique to the southwest of Scotland, and particularly to Burnswark. There are these three from Birrens, known as the Birrens 3, and there are 2 from just outside Stanwick in Carlisle, and there's 1 from Housesteads, and that's it in the whole of the Roman Empire. The other reported so-called acorn-shaped ones are indeed acorns if you take them out of the cup. So they're lemon-shaped, effectively, but have been called acorns mistakenly. So that somehow has got into the literature. The other thing that we've discovered is that there's a fair proportion of them have holes in them. 10% of the Burnswark specimens, these are other specimens from Greece, from the British Museum, showing that these holes do occur. And Tracy Ryle in Wales has suggested that these are poison holes, as referred to in the ancient literature. We're not convinced, but they're certainly there. This is the group from the National Museum of Scotland, and I'd like to thank Peter Hunter for letting us examine these, and they do indeed have these holes. And 2 of the specimens still have plugs of material in them. So it may be interesting to go on and have a look and see, analyse what that material actually is. So they weren't washed out at the time of the original excavations. So, on to our work. Joby described gateways here, and there was another suggested gateway here to match this eastern titulus or ballista platform, and he found sling bullets in profusion at the western gate and the centre gate. He found a single one at the so-called eastern gate, which in fact Joby went on to show was not a gate at all. The palisadian rampart had originally been continuous there, and there was no evidence that there was actually a paved entrance as there was at the centre and in the west gate. He also found one at the site of a native roundhouse in this area B. And then, interestingly, almost every trench at Burnswark turned up something interesting. There was a trilby arrowhead in this very narrow trench 1, and here in trench 11 on the north face was in fact an almost mint coin of Domitian, a denarius of Domitian, and a Roman sword, lying not in a votive context, but literally on the surface of the rampart. And Joby did not offer an interpretation for why a Roman sword was there. And then latterly, in the ploughing that took place here in the forestry plantation, a lance head was found, which is suspiciously like the elongated ballista heads that are currently being found at Hartshorn in Germany. So Scarf said needed more work to try and sort out whether this was a siege or whether it was a training camp. And so Andy and I put our heads together and came up with a solution to use metal detecting, as in conflict archaeology, to look for artefact distribution. There's nothing new about this. There are metal detected projectile scatters in numerous archaeological works throughout the world. It was pioneered in America at the Little Bighorn site, but also used extensively at English Civil War sites, Culloden, Killiecrankie, and lesser well known but important to us in terms of lead sling bullets, Bicula in Andalusia and Velsen. And for the sharp-eyed, that should actually be the Frisian revolt, not the Batavian revolt. So, what was the dilemma for us? Well, unlike these other sites, Burnswark has a stratified site underneath where the potential scatter would be, so selective extraction of any finds would cause damage to the stratigraphy and to the interpretation of the site. So we came up with a research design to go to Historic Scotland, which suggested that we should carry out non-invasive metal detection with profiling of the metals that were underneath the ground. Essentially a form of geophys, but very, very accurate geophys, and then to practice, to take the targets, and log them via GIS to a map, and this is an example of the sort of way that the detector works. You get an absolute figure. This is a Roman iron nail. You get an absolute figure here and some idea of the depth and position of the object. And here you can see iron coming in at 03, 04. Here's a 303 cartridge, which we assumed because there'd been a Second World War observation post on the top, we might find some. They come in at 70. And copper coins coming in over 90. But the most important thing, and quite separate from all the other readings, are the readings from lead. And lead comes in on an average of 82. So these are the clusters of the profiles that we were looking for. And of course, predominantly looking for lead targets. We had our trusty Detectors, a retired occupational therapist and a retired firearms officer from the Scottish Police Force. And the Detectors can cover an acre in about 3 hours with overlapping sweeps. The surface of Burnswark not particularly lends itself to detection. There's a lot of reeds and marram grass, so only about 50% of the surface of the hill fort was detectable. More of the Roman and the north and south camps were detectable. The long grass like this keeps the detector head away from the surface. But finds we did make, we made 420 finds over the course of the 5 days. And Andy assiduously recorded their geolocation and also the metal profile. At this point, I'm going to say something briefly about the difference between clay and lead shot. clay shot is quite prevalent from numerous sites in Scotland, but because it's clay, to get the same ballistic profile as lead, it has to be much bigger. It has to be substantially chunkier than the lead shot. And that, of course, has a ballistic difference in terms of penetration. So if you compare a 30mm marble with a 10mm or a 12mm lead projectile, you can see that the marbles do actually penetrate, but the lead balls go straight through. They go through ballistic gelatin as if it's not there. Whereas the golf ball can't even get beyond the skin. And this led us to look more at the stopping power of lead slingshot. And a 50-gram lead slingshot fired from a sling is just less than a 44 Magnum in terms of its kinetic energy. So obviously using lead carries with it a considerably greater ballistic advantage. There are also, when we looked into the slinging profile, there are two ways to sling a lead ball. You can either have a lob, a very high trajectory lob, that will get you between 300 and 400 metres out from the slinger, or, as is used currently in the Balearic Islands for competition and so on, that if you wanted to aim directly at something, you go at 100 or 150 metres with a much lower profile sling. So this is an example of the lob. Very high trajectory, easily 300 metres, which is longer than the composite bow. But when you're using direct attack, it's a horizontal approach, and it's very, very accurate. And accuracy is recorded both from modern slingers and also from the ancients, which show that accuracy to the size of a head is fairly standard at 100 metres, and the effect of lead is substantial in striking something that's relatively soft. So the front rampart of Burnswark is exactly optimum slinging distance for direct slinging practice, or not for the practice of direct slinging. And these are the find sites from our survey, and you can see that there's a fair scatter, but there are a predominance of slingshots all the way along the front rampart. We take these ones here to be overflies, because if you just narrowly miss the front rampart, you will overfly by a substantial distance because of the trajectory. And these are rollbacks caused by erosion over the intervening centuries. If you profile the targets, the x-axis is the absolute target ID. So if you profile these, lead comes out, we have 205 probable new sling bullets still in the soil, over 100 new iron targets, and then copper alloy, a relatively small number. These are almost certainly shotgun cartridges. They have a fairly characteristic profile. We're not sure about these. These are probably a mixed bag of coins and probably some of the very smaller sling bullets, the ones with the holes in them. And you can see the spread. The gateways where Joby predicted the targets were are actually only part of the whole picture. And if you group the individual sling bullets to the higher density areas, you can see that they run predominantly along the front of the rampart and not just at the gates, over a distance of about 200 metres. And this is exactly the area that, if you were to attack the fort, has got the best incline for troops running up after some forward shot. So, just to mention briefly, Mike Bishop said it's one thing to drop a small denomination coin, quite another to lose a sword. And so I think we have to think about why these projectiles are there, and not just assume that they've been left over by an aspect of practice. So, our conclusions are non-invasive detecting is probably useful on an appropriate site type. Burnswark is almost unique. The soil is shallow, there's been no ploughing, it's never been arable land really, so there is not much in the way of iron or other material contamination. So we're finding a disproportionately high number of good targets. We think the sling bullets are aimed directly in this low-profile type of slinging at a wide area of rampart, not just at the gateways, and from an extension of that interpretation, that this was probably an assault rather than a siege. A siege would suggest that the Romans camped there for quite a long time and tried to starve out the natives. I suspect that probably when it came to it, it was just an all-out attack from a defended encampment. And then magnitude of the site, because of the magnitude of material left over, it looks like a use of exemplary force, and you can speculate about what the cause of that might have been. We think that we need to do a lot more work on the studies of the slingshot, both on the ballistics of it and also this vexed question of whether they are truly poisoned or not. And so a further phase of investigation is required. In September, we'll be completing the metal detector survey of the site. A team from Frankfurt coming over to help us with further geophysical survey on the site to nail down once and for all, hopefully, if there was or wasn't circumvallation around the site. We're going to carry out limited ground truthing because, of course, we've still to prove that these targets are what we think they are, although we're fairly confident that the lead targets are sling bullets, because in previous excavations, less than 3% of the lead objects found were anything other than lead sling bullets. And then there's metallurgy on the lead and toxicology on the plugs within the lead. So I'd like to thank Sir John Buchanan Jarden, who's taken an interest in this work, the landowner who's been very supportive. We'd like to thank our friends at Historic Scotland, National Museum, Glasgow University, Treasure Trove Unit and Dumfriesshire Museums. And finally, last word I would imagine would go to the anonymous presenter of this paper in 1792 who said, "The whole to me suggests the idea of a siege." Thank you all very much.